Washington doesn't break in one dramatic scream. It breaks in procedural votes, paper memos, and public daylight when leaders stop pretending they're aligned. In the last few weeks, that's exactly what we've seen. Senate Republicans, often cautious, often disciplined, showing visible fractures with President Trump on the question that sits underneath almost every chaos headline. Who controls U.S. military force, Congress, or the White House? Here's the reality-based hook. The Senate moved to advance a war powers measure aimed at limiting further unauthorized hostilities in or against Venezuela, with Republicans joining Democrats. That's not a rumor. It's on the Senate's own roll call record. The White House opposed it in writing, again, not rumor, through an official statement of administration policy. Days later, the effort collapsed in a procedural fight and a tied vote broken by Vice President J.D. Vance after intense pressure and last-minute assurances. That's reported by AP and the Washington Post, and the vote trail is public. At the same time, Senate Republicans publicly pushed back on the administration's Greenland military rhetoric. Another sign that Senate leadership and the caucus aren't always marching in lockstep with Trump's maximal messaging. So the title you clicked, Senate Leadership Breaks with Trump, needs a careful translation. Not abandonment, not total chaos, but a measurable stress test inside the GOP between loyalty to Trump and loyalty to the Senate's institutional power. Tonight, we're going to do this the only way the brief desk does it. Confirmed, unconfirmed, analysis, scenarios, no vibes without receipts. Let's lock down what we can prove and label what we can't. Confirmed, the Senate advanced a war powers measure targeting Venezuela. On January 8, 2026, the Senate agreed to a procedural step involving SJ Res 98, a war powers resolution, by recorded vote. That's in the Senate's roll call system. Reuters reporting, cited via a reprint, describes this procedural advance as 52-47, with 5 Republicans joining Democrats. The White House opposed it in writing. The White House issued a statement of administration policy saying it strongly opposes passage of SJ Res 98, and it references a January 3rd action in Venezuela as part of its justification for opposing congressional constraints. There is a DOJ OLC memo, and it's public. A redacted DOJ Office of Legal Counsel memo exists as a PDF, dated December 23, 2025, addressing the legality of a proposed Venezuela operation framed as supporting law enforcement. That document is hosted by DOJ. Major outlets then reported on that memo's role and controversy. The effort failed after pressure and a tie, per AP WAPO, and the vote record exists. AP and the Washington Post report the final outcome. The effort was halted in a 50-50 tie, with J.D. Vance breaking it, after 2 Republicans flipped from their earlier position following administration assurances. The Senate roll call vote record for the key Jan 14 procedural maneuver exists. Senate Republicans also pushed back publicly on Greenland military rhetoric. The Washington Post reported Republican pushback against White House Greenland military threat rhetoric, another example of Senate-side resistance to Trump-driven messaging. Unconfirmed claim, Senate leadership abandoned Trump. Unconfirmed as a formal leadership decision. We can verify fractures, votes, and public pushback. We cannot verify a coordinated abandonment without explicit leadership statements or documented internal decisions. Now that the categories are clean, timeline. The operation, then the fallout. The White House SAP references January 3rd U.S. military action in Venezuela as context for why it opposed Congress stepping in. Major reporting also describes the operation's legal and political shockwave, including the DOJ memo that later surfaced publicly. Congress reasserts itself briefly. On January 8th, the Senate took a significant procedural step to move forward with SJ Res 98, a war powers resolution. The Senate's roll call record documents that action. Reuters described it as a rare rebuke. 5 Republicans joined Democrats to advance the measure. This is where leadership breaks starts to mean something practical. The Senate, by its rules and its recorded votes, allowed the train onto the tracks even with the White House opposing it. The legal memo becomes gasoline. A DOJ Office of Legal Counsel memo, redacted, exists and is public. The Washington Post reported on that memo's substance and the controversy it triggered about executive authority and international law considerations. The Senate snaps back under pressure. On January 14th, AP and the Washington Post report the effort was effectively killed after a 50-50 deadlock broken by Vice President J.D. Vance, and after two Republicans reversed course after administration lobbying and assurances from Secretary of State Rubio. The Senate's Jan 14 roll call vote record exists for the procedural mechanism used. Greenland fractures add to the story. As this was unfolding, the Washington Post reported Republicans pushing back on the White House's Greenland military rhetoric. And AP reports Rubio also had to address Greenland and NATO concerns during Senate testimony, meaning these break moments aren't isolated to one file. They're stacking. So what changed? The short answer is the Senate got spooked, then got squeezed. Now let's explain the mechanism, because this story is really about how Washington restrains power. This story isn't just Trump versus senators. It's Washington's oldest fight, the presidency's impulse to move fast, and Congress's constitutional role to authorize war. S.J. Resolution 98 is a war powers resolution aimed at directing removal of U.S. forces from hostilities in or against Venezuela that Congress has not authorized. The bill's framing is public on congress.gov, but here's what the public misses. Procedure is power. On January 8th, the Senate took a procedural vote to discharge S.J. Resolution 98, moving it forward. That vote is recorded on the Senate's site. Reuters characterized the result as 52 of 47, with 5 Republicans joining Democrats. Then, on January 14th, the fight turns into a procedural knife fight, a point of order and privileged status. That's not glamorous, but it's how the Senate kills things without a cleanup or down narrative. The Jan 14 roll call vote exists. AP and WAPO then described the real-world consequence. The resolution was effectively defeated after the tie and the vice president's tie-breaking vote, with senators citing administration assurances. Now layer in the White House's formal stance. The administration's SAP says it strongly opposes the resolution and references January 3rd strikes in Venezuela as context. And then there's the DOJ memo. DOJ's OLC memo exists as a PDF and outlines legal analysis for a Venezuela operation framed as law enforcement support. The Washington Post describes how the memo became central to the public debate and the constitutional criticism. Analysis. This is what Senate leadership breaks can look like in the real world. Not a televised resignation, but a moment when enough senators are willing to put their names on a vote that signals, we want oversight. Then the counterforce arrives. Pressure, assurances, procedural tools, and the break partially closes. So the Senate didn't abandon Trump, but it did show a visible fracture, and then a visible reconsolidation attempt. Next, the players and their incentives. The administration's incentive is direct and explicit. Maintain operational flexibility. The SAP opposing S.J. Resolution 98 is the on-paper version of that incentive. WAPO reporting shows the White House lobbying senators and leaning on assurances to stop constraints. Senate Republican leadership? Leadership's incentive is survival. Keep the conference together, avoid public splits that look like loss of control, and prevent a precedent that makes it easier to box in a Republican White House later. That incentive is consistent with how the procedural defeat played out. We're not asserting any private conversations. We're reading the incentives from the public outcome and the institutional logic described by AP WAPO, the Republican break senators. On Jan 8th, Reuters reported 5 Republicans joined Democrats to advance the measure. By Jan 14, AP reports at least 2 had flipped after pressure and assurances, showing how quickly incentives shift when the White House leans in. Democrats. Democrats' incentive is to reassert congressional war authority and force public accountability for executive action. That incentive is embedded in the war power structure and in how AP WAPO describe Democratic arguments. Rubio's role, AP and WAPO describe Rubio's testimony assurances as pivotal in convincing senators the administration wouldn't expand action the way critics feared. That sets up the impact, what this means for governance, allies, and the risk pipeline. Governance credibility, who's actually steering. When the Senate publicly advances a war powers constraint, Jan 8, then kills it under pressure, Jan 14, it sends 2 conflicting signals. Oversight exists, and the White House can still muscle it back. Legal precedent risk. The DOJ memo exists and is public. The Washington Post reports the memo's reasoning intensified criticism about how far executive power can stretch without Congress, especially if international law questions are treated as secondary. Foreign policy spillover, Greenland, NATO. This isn't happening in a vacuum. AP reports Rubio had to address Greenland and NATO concerns during Senate testimony, meaning senators are weighing a broader pattern, not a single operation. And the Washington Post's reporting on GOP pushback regarding Greenland military rhetoric shows senators are willing to contradict Trump-linked signaling when they believe it endangers alliances or credibility. We're not dropping made-up market moves, but policy uncertainty, especially involving tariffs, force, and oversight, tends to increase risk perception. What we can verify is that these issues were serious enough to dominate Senate hearings and major national security reporting. Now, what happens next? 3 scenarios, clearly labeled with what would confirm them. Scenario A, assurances become formalized oversight. What it looks like: more frequent consultation, briefings, and clearer notice to Congress before major actions, without Congress successfully passing binding constraints. What would confirm it? Official commitments, consistent classified briefings, and public acknowledgement from leadership that consultation is now routine. Scenario B, repeat clash, new operation triggers new war powers attempt. What it looks like: another vote, another procedural fight, potentially subpoenas or litigation over executive authority, especially if new actions occur without clear authorization. What would confirm it? New war powers resolutions filed, committee action, subpoena language, or formal legal challenges tied to the OLC memo rationale. Scenario C, Senate GOP tightens discipline behind Trump. What it looks like: fewer defections, quicker leadership moves to block constraints, and a stronger conference unity message. What would confirm it? Repeated votes showing minimal GOP defections, plus explicit leadership statements rejecting future constraints. No crystal balls here, only triggers you can watch in public documents and vote records.